Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Levine, who's our rabbi at the local Orthodox Shul Am Echad in Willow Glen. He's been the rabbi there since 2007 and has been responsible for growing our congregation to the strong congregation it is today. And this is I believe the fourth time that he spoke to our group. So as you all know from his previous talks, all four of his grandparents are Holocaust survivors, or were Holocaust survivors. And I think the first time he talked to us, I told you he had 7 children. I think the next time I told you it was up to 8. Well, guess what? 9. So, what better revenge on Hitler can you have than that? Right? With some other interesting facts about Rabbi Levine. He attended the famed Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem, and he also attended law school at prestigious Ivy League school, Penn, and he's been very inspirational to me, and in fact today's topic also is very meaningful to me, because when I first joined Am Echad, it was about 5 years ago when my dad, of blessed memory, passed away. And I wanted to say Kaddish for him on a daily basis. So I went to Am Echad, and they provided me that opportunity, as well as the opportunity to grow much stronger in my Yiddishkeit and spiritually. So with that, Rabbi Levine.
Thank you, Russ. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I say this unequivocally, that really I feel honored to be here today. This group, which in general of survivors or children of survivors, is especially meaningful to me. As mentioned, all 4 of my grandparents are Holocaust surviving people who keep the memory of the Holocaust, keep the memory of those who passed away in the Holocaust, and those who survived alive, I view as extraordinarily noble and worthy, and I'm humbled and honored to be here today. As mentioned, this is the 4th time that I've had the opportunity to speak here, and although my hat is black, I think I wear different hats, and sometimes when I've spoken here in the past, I've had different angles. My first time I spoke here was being a grandchild of 4 survivors, a 3rd generation survivor. So I think I spoke primarily as a grandchild of 4 Polish Holocaust survivors. The next time I spoke was about the Nuremberg trials and the idea of revenge and law. So I have a law background. I spoke as a historian, I have a history background. And the 3rd time I spoke was really spiritual greatness in the Holocaust. And then I used my rabbinic background. Today, I think it's going to be a little bit of a combination of my rabbinic. That's about, the title of this lecture is Yizkor, Yahrzeits, baby naming, and genealogy, honoring and memorializing our loved ones. So that's certainly going to be rabbinic. But also, of course, as a grandchild of survivors. So in line with today's lecture, I'm going to dedicate in this lecture in honor of my great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, great-uncles, great-aunts, even uncle and aunt who were murdered in the Holocaust. It should be an Aliyah Neshama for them. There's a work called Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch was a book which details and delineates the rationale for all the mitzvahs. It was written in the 13th century in Spain. And in that book, Sefer HaChinuch, the author writes the following thing. In the Yibum, in the Levirate marriage, that the idea, if somebody passes away without children, that there's an idea that a sibling should marry the wife. Says, verstehe you this? People here speak Yiddish a little bit? Oh, some of it, it's all. But Holocaust, so Zak the Sefer HaChinuch, explain the Sefer HaChinuch, that it's the reason is that we should have a sort of physical remembrance in the physical world. What does the verse, the pasuk say? Shlo yimach shmo mi Yisrael. That his name should not be erased from Israel. Why should this marriage take place? That this name, this person, should not be forgotten. The Ksav Sofer, Rabbi Avram Shmuel Binyamin Sofer, who was arguably the greatest sage in the mid-19th century in Central Europe. He was the Rav and Rosh Hashiva of Bratislavia in Pressburg. The Ksav Sofer says, you know why we have tombstones, matzevas? It's that the names of the should not be forgotten from this world. And when you go to a cemetery, you could have just had lots of places, but that name, that person, that individual should not be forgotten. Eli Wiesel, in his acceptance of his Nobel Peace Prize in 1986, so he had a lecture entitled Hope, Despair, and Memory. It's a remarkable, you can download it, it's on the Nobel sites under Nobel Lectures. And in this Nobel Peace Prize, which Eli Wiesel won, he started, of course, with his book Night about his own experiences in the Holocaust, and he went on to be an advocate for the Russian Jews, who at that time in 1986 were still behind the Iron Curtain. And in his lecture, in his speech, he says the following thing: remembering is a noble and necessary act. The call of memory, the call to memory, reaches us from the very dawn of history. No commandment figures so frequently, so insistently in the Bible. It is incumbent upon us to remember the good we have received and the evil we have suffered. New Year's Day, which is called Rosh Hashanah, is also called Yom HaZikaron, the day of memory. On that day, the universal judgment man appeals to God to remember. Our salvation depends on us. If God wishes to remember our salvation, all will be well. Thus, the rejection of memory becomes a divine curse, one that would doom us to past disasters, past wars. Later on in his speech, he said the following thing: the great historian Simon Dubinov served as our guide and inspiration. Until the moment of his death, he said over and over again to his companions in the Riga ghetto, Yidden, schreibt und unverschreibt. Jews, write it all down. His words were heeded. Overnight, countless victims of the Holocaust became chroniclers and historians in the ghettos and even in the death camps. Even members of its Sonderkommandos, those inmates forced to burn their fellow inmates' corpses before being burned in turn, left behind extraordinary documents. To testify became an obsession. They left us poems and letters, diaries and fragments of novels, some known throughout the world, others still unpublished. And he talks about this topic at length. It's actually remarkable that, therefore, there's really no Hebrew word. There's no word for history. There's no biblical word for history. The modern day word for history in Israel is historia. It's not a biblical word. Right? The key word of the Bible, of Tanakh, is memory. It's zikaron. The word zachar, or one of the forms, appears no fewer than 169 times in the Hebrew Bible. Yidden, Jews, were to be a people of memory. And there is a profound difference between history and memory. History is his story. There's Chinese history, Russian history, Babylonian history, African history, Native American history. It's their story. Sometimes it happens to other people. Memory is my story. It's something that happens to me. It's part of who I am. History is information. Like, you could study the information of cultures, of things that occurred, but it doesn't necessarily impact you. It could expand our horizons, actually. For those who are interested, I have 40 hours of Jewish history online, and I'm happy to give it to anybody. That is our history, but it's memory. It's the past and present. You know, in that history series, I said the following thing, that if we don't know our own history is our memory. We don't have our own history. We're like a person who wakes up in the morning and we don't know who we are. Do you imagine tomorrow morning waking up and not knowing any of our family members, not knowing where we went to school, where we live? How would we live? We wouldn't understand who we are. And we're talking about memory. What we're really talking about is our history. It's who we are. That we are products of this history. It impacts us. I imagine we can't understand any of us in this room unless we knew about the Holocaust. We never understand who we are. Actually, you should have a refuah, shlema, complete recovery, Yossi Reino, who, you know, every time I would see him, like, if you didn't know the Holocaust, you would never understand him. You couldn't understand such a lively person, or we would see him lively again, unless you understood what the Holocaust is. But there's something else, I think, that today in particular I want to touch upon. Because even if we have memory, you know, and we remember the Holocaust, remember the events, and this crowd really honestly does not need to know, we know the details, but if we forget the people, the individuals, that is a tremendous loss. Because if the legacy of the Holocaust is remembered, the 6 million people, but we forget the individuals, what a tragic loss for them and for us. I remember I went at the age, I just turned 18 with my yeshiva to Poland. And again, I grew up with my mother's parents. My mother was a product of her second marriage. Of her parents, both were married before the Holocaust. My grandfather saw his wife and 2 kids shot in front of his eyes. My grandmother, I grew up with the stories. But when I remember being there, and to this day, I think the most profound, when it hit me, when I was in Auschwitz, and I was just looking at the shoes, and I was just looking, who in the world wore these shoes? Like, they were people. You just look in a room and you see shoes, and you see other things in the other room, and you think to yourself, like, everyone had an owner. Who were the owners? Mitch Albom. Anyone know who Mitch Albom is? Sure. Right? Mitch Albom is from Detroit. His books have been published about 40 million times. 40 million copies of his books have been published. He's a playwright, journalist, author, screenwriter, radio and television broadcaster. He had Tuesdays with Maury, The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, For One More Day, Have a Little Faith, The Timekeeper, The First Phone Call from Heaven, The Magic Strings of Frankie Pesto, and the next person you meet in heaven. He has a very often Jewish motifs. And in one of his books called Have a Little Faith, anyone read that book, Have a Little Faith? So, Have a Little Faith, the story begins with an 82-year-old rabbi who calls Reb, who's asked to deliver a eulogy. And in the book, he says the following thing. It's a remarkable thing. What do people fear the most about death? I asked Reb. Fear? He thought for a moment. Well, for one thing, what happens next? Where do we go? Is what we imagine. That's big. Yes, but there's something else. What else do people fear about death? Being forgotten, he whispered. There's a cemetery not far from my house with graves that date back to the 19th century. I have never seen anyone come there to lay a flower. Most people just wander through, read the engravings, and say, wow, look how old. The cemetery came to mind in the Reb's office. after he quoted a poem both beautiful and heartbreaking, written by Thomas Hardy. It told of a man among tombstones, conversing with the dead below. The recently buried souls lamented the older souls that had already slid from memory. They count as quite forgot. They are men who have existed not. Theirs is a loss of fitful breath. It is the second death. The second death. The unvisited in nursing homes, the homeless found in frozen alleys, who mourned their passing, who marked their time on earth. Once, on a trip to Russia, the Rabbi called, we found an old Orthodox synagogue. Inside, there was an elderly man standing alone, saying the mourner's Kaddish. Being polite, we asked him for who he was saying it for. He looked up and he answered, I am saying it for myself, because nobody else would. And today I really want to talk about preventing a second death. That for the martyrs, for the people who were murdered, for our relatives and for our loved ones, what we can do, that their memory, their legacy, their deeds should be remembered in this word. Hashem is always Yizkor. Hashem has all of the names of all of those people who died, Al Kiddush Hashem, who died only because they were Jews, who were murdered and tortured and abused. But what could we do here for those individuals? So I want to start with Yizkor. Now, Yizkor, does everyone know what Yizkor is? Everyone heard of Yizkor, right? So Yizkor is what we do in the synagogue. It's to remember the deceased. It's an act. It's just not just catharsis. It's an actual remember the deceased. Now, there's an important idea here, a fundamental idea, and that is the following thing. It is based on a firm Jewish belief that our acts, our deeds, could bring merit to the deceased, especially relatives, in particular children. They have the ability to bring their relatives to a higher place. Actually, Yizkor, one of the great men of thought in the 20th century, his name was Rabbi Chaim Friedlander. So he brings down that Yizkor is to mention. We want to mention their names in front of Hashem, that Hashem should remember them for the good. That Hashem should remember all of the good they did for us, and with that they should be rewarded in the eternal world, in Olam Haba. But it's not just that they should be remembered; it's that we want to remember them so they can inspire us. There was many years ago. I remember him really the year before he passed away. There was a famous Maggid. A Maggid was a person who gave spiritual inspiration for hundreds of years in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Hungary. There was something called a Maggid, and he would go around to the synagogues and talk about ethics, about fear of God, about improving on oneself, about how to keep the Torah. And one of the famous people from Jerusalem, his name is Rabbi Shadron, he went in the 1960s to London to collect for a Jewish organization. And when he was there, somebody stopped him and told him the following: you should know that my father was from the greatest Maggids in Budapest, in Hungary, before the Holocaust. He told the following story, that when he was 9 years old, he remembers going with his father to a shiva house. His father made him come with him. And he went to a shiva house of an individual who was a Schneider, a tailor, and it was a simple man who was observant, and his son was completely, totally non-observant. Did nothing Jewish, no connection to anything. And he went to this house, and he remembers his father sitting there with this individual, the son who was alive, this tailor, and his name was Moshe. He was also a tailor. He worked for his father. He's called Moshe the Schneider. And he just talked to him. And the next day, his father brought him back again. And the second time his father was in the shiva house, he said to this Moshe the Schneider, it would be great if you would come to the synagogue to say Kaddish for your father. Now this is a young man, or it wasn't so young, but a man who did nothing. We call him today completely unaffiliated. No connection to anything. And surprisingly, this Moshe the Schneider became, not only to come to synagogue, but became completely observant. So much so that this boy, whose name was Laszlo, or Ezra was his Jewish name, this Laszlo, this Ezra said that in the synagogue, if you talked, he was the one who said, shh. Right? He was the person who everyone had to watch out. He became very religious. And it was right before Eichmann came into Hungary, to Rahman al-Litzlan, attack the Jewish community there. And that was when he was 9. It was 3 years later, when he was 12 years old in 1944, he said it was the last time he ever saw his parents. He was taken away from his parents at the age of 12 years old. He never saw them again. And he was in the camps, and he grew up a religious boy. His father was a Maggid. But he had, in the camps, there's no Shabbos, there's no kosher, there's nothing Jewish. And he was an orphan, and when the war ended, he was still an orphan, and he grew up in a house that was Sabbath observant, and he was so far off at that moment, but he still wanted to keep Shabbos after the war. And as they got better, he became friends. His bunkmates, his roommates in this rehabilitation, I'm not sure if it was a DP camp or they were still in Hungary, said one Friday night, let's go to town. Take a trolley, let's go to town and see the nightlife. Let's live again. Let's go out and live. And this Laszlo, this Ezra, didn't want to do it because he still, even though he wanted to try to keep Shabbos again. And his friend Thomas, well-meaning, didn't know anything about it, said to him, come, let's go. You have to get out. You got to live again. And he pushed him to go out Friday night. And he was so uncertain. This is what he wanted to do. He's thinking about his father and his parents. And as they're going to walk to the trolley, his friend Thomas offers him a cigarette. And he didn't know what to say. Thomas lights it for him. He takes a cigarette. He takes a puff. And he gets on the trolley to go to the town. And the whole time he's thinking, should I be doing this? But in the moment, he's just I'll let it go. I got to live again. I just went through Hell. And he's going on the trolley, and one half part of him saying, let's just enjoy life for a moment. And the other saying, I hope nothing happens. I hope no one sees me. And as he's on the trolley, he can't believe it. As he's on the trolley going down to the town from the hill, he sees Moshe the Schneider. This person who several years earlier at the age of 9 remembers his father taking him. This Moshe the Schneider, he sees him walking on front. He thinks to himself, if Moshe the Schneider would see me on the trolley with a cigarette, he got off, told us the Maggid, he got off the trolley, he walked back, and since that day, over 20 years later, he keeps the Shabbos. Then he told the Maggid the following thing. He says, I never saw Moshe the Schneider again. And now when I look back at it, I'm not sure did I actually see it. But he was Yizkor. He remembered at the age of 9 going with his father and impacting. When you remember somebody, it affects us. It's not just a person that we bring merit. We bring merit to us. Actually, the idea of Yizkor is to pray for the dead, to remember to pray for the dead. That Hanukkah is coming. One of the first mentions of praying for the dead is in the book of Maccabees. Judah the Maccabee, and his friends in the book of Maccabees, they prayed for the murder, those who died fighting the Greeks. It's actually in several midrashim. But Yizkor, the idea what we do today, was instituted right after the First Crusade, when Jews were massacred in Mainz, Spires, and Worms. That after the First Crusade, they instituted Yizkor. And originally, Yizkor was only done on Yom Kippur. Why on Yom Kippur? A remarkable thing. On Yom Kippur, does anyone know what we call Yom HaKippurim? Yom Kippur is in plural. You know why that is? Because when we atone on Yom Kippur, we don't just fix ourselves, we fix our ancestors as well. Think about it. Let's say a person grew up in a home, for whatever reason they screamed a lot. And now a person on Yom Kippur makes amends and doesn't scream. What happens? You're fixing the past, right? You know, my mother-in-law is a professor of social work at NYU, at New York University, and she will tell you, her specialty is abuse, both domestic abuse, social, sexual, all kinds of terrible abuse. If a child is abused, they are not a little bit more likely, they're much, much more likely to abuse their own children. Because that is what they're used to. That's what they're accustomed to. So God forbid a child of abuse, they'll be much more likely to abuse their own children. So what happens when this child fixes themselves? They're fixing their past as well. So Yom Kippur was the ideal day to have Yizkor, to remember and to bring merit to our past. Not only did they pray, but originally, and even today, it was based off a verse in Parshas Re'eh in Deuteronomy that you should not close your fist to others. So as a merit on Yizkor, it's not that synagogues like to raise money, there's a Yizkor appeal, right? A pledge. Why do they do that? Because part of the merit for the deceased is to give charity, tzedakah, in their merit. In fact, the liturgy, the nusach of Yizkor actually says that I'm going to pledge. I'm not just going to pray for them. I'm actually going to give money in their memory. Who do we say Yizkor for? We say Yizkor. You could say certainly for parents, grandparents, children, family, and friends. One question I've had is, let's say, like my grandparents, their first spouses were murdered. Could you say it for your first spouse, right? Or if someone's spouse just dies, could you say it? What if they're remarried? But since Yizkor is quiet, nobody hears you, it's appropriate to say Yizkor for our first spouse as well. One of the customs of Yizkor is to light candles. Actually, in a house of mourning, one of the things that you do is you have a 7-day candle. If you sign a memorial, God forbid, we should have no one passed away. One of the things they'll give you, or Okil, they will give you a 7-day candle. Some people will light one candle a day. Others will say a 7-day candle. So by Yizkor, there is an idea to light a candle. That's based on a verse in Mishlei in Proverbs. King Solomon wrote in Mishlei, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, that the soul of a man is like a candle, it's like a flame. And then the idea is that just like there's a flicker of a candle, it's a remembering, so to memorialize the soul. The Yizkor today for Ashkenaz Jews is done all the holidays. So it's done on Pesach, Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot, and Yom Kippur. And certainly it's an important thing to do. I would encourage, if anybody has relatives on Yizkor, to do it, to light a candle. Some people light one candle for all of them, and many people will even light individual candles. Lastly, on this topic of Yizkor, it's an interesting thing. Lord Emanuel Jacobowitz, a rabbi doctor, he had lots of honorifics. Right? He was the chief rabbi in England in the 1980s, I think in the 1970s. So Rabbi Lord Jacobowitz, so he notes that Yizkor is futuristic. It's in Hebrew called Atid. It's futuristic. Just like God remembers Noah, God remembers Abraham, and God remembers Rachel. All of those times, something happened afterwards. So he points out, when we go to Yizkor, when we remember our loved ones, our relatives, people that passed away, it should impact us. It should inspire us for the future. That's the idea of Yizkor. I just want to end off Yizkor with an amazing story. And this story happened just a little less than 40 years ago. About 40 years ago, has anyone ever been to Israel during the holidays? Any of the holidays? Right, so you know that many people go to Israel for the holidays. So there was a Mr. Goldstein, I think it was like 1980 that this story happened. There's a Mr. Goldstein flying from London to Israel to spend Yom Kippur and some of the other holidays in Israel. And he gets on the plane in a flight from London to Ben Gurion Airport. Who's the majority of the flights? Jews. So he gets down the plane, he sees a gentleman next to him, he starts a conversation. He says, where are you going? I'm going to Israel. So he says, where are you from? From London. I'm also from London, not from Manchester. He says, well, why don't you come over one of these days? It was, Mr. Goldstein happened to be religious. The other person happened to not look particularly. Why don't you come over for a Saturday, for Shabbos, for a meal? The guy, when he heard that, picks up his sleeves, shows him his numbers, and said, I don't do Sabbath anymore. He says, you see these numbers? I went to the camp with my beloved son, and the whole time in the camp, I prayed to God, just save my son. Just save my son. That's all I'm asking for. Give me my son. Don't take him from me. And he said, I never saw my son again. So I don't do Shabbos, I don't do Yom Kippur, I don't keep kosher, I don't put on tefillin. I did that before the war. Nothing. So this Mr. Goldstein said to the survivor's name was Morris Schechter. He said, Mr. Schechter, I don't want to say it. Maybe just give me your number, we'll exchange numbers. Maybe one day you'll come. And Mr. Morris Schechter said, well, maybe. And he wanted to get into him after the fight, but in the old days, remember Ben Gurion, and we go to Israel, you used to kiss the ground, you come there, they take you to the tarmac. Yeah. Now it's boring, they pull you right up to the gates, and you don't have that. But in the old days, you got there and everyone's walking around. This is also before all the security, people and he lost track of this Morris Schechter. He didn't think about him. He checked into the King David Hotel, and Yom Kippur came, and he went to one of the synagogues in Jerusalem. And on Yom Kippur, as mentioned, we do Yizkor. This Mr. Goldstein walked out on Yizkor. He was fortunate that his parents were still alive. He had no one to say Yizkor for. So he walked out and he went for a few, Yizkor's 10, 15 minutes. He went to get some fresh air outside. And he goes down about a block, and he can't believe it. He sees this guy, Morris Schechter, who was sitting next to him on the plane. And he was eating a sandwich on Yom Kippur. So he says to Morris, today's Yom Kippur. At least don't eat on Yom Kippur. Morris, come on. He said, didn't I tell you? I don't keep Yom Kippur. I don't do anything anymore. He said, listen, it's Yizkor now. It's Yizkor now. Go in and say Yizkor. I'm not going to say Yizkor, he says. So an act of desperation is, say it for your son. Do Yizkor for your son. So at that moment, something snapped in this Morris Schechter, and he said, I can't go because I'm not really dressed for the moment. He said, nobody's going to care. And after a few more minutes of back and forth, this Morris Schechter agreed to go in on Yizkor and to say Yizkor for his son. And this is something they do with certain things. They go up and they tell the Chazan their name. So you have to walk to the center of the synagogue. He comes in looking like he didn't belong there. But he goes with this Mr. Goldstein to say Yizkor for his son. And the Chazan says to him, what's your son's name? And he said, Yaakov. He says, well, what's your name? Morris. He says, no, what's your Hebrew name? So he says, Moshe. So he said, well, what's your last name? So he says to him, what do you need my last name? Yizkor, you don't do last names. What do you need my last name for? It's Yaakov ben Moshe. He says, what's your last name? So he said, Schechter. And the Chazan looks at him, and this is a true story. And he says to him, Dad?
Oh no.
Abba? Yaakov ben Moshe. Are you Moshe ben Yaakov? And, I don't know what happened after with this Morris Schechter. But when you come to say Yizkor, you gain. You connect to who you are. Connect to your family. You connect to your relatives. That is to forget, to give, even this Morris Schechter, whom one can never judge his life, to forget his son, but to say Yizkor, you actually connect to your son. This story on the deepest level. The next thing is Yahrzeits. So Sfardim, actually I have every year, every week almost, a Sephardi Jew will come in, Azkara. They call it Azkara, or Hashkava. We call it Yahrzeits. What's Yahrzeits mean? What? Yar? What?
Remembrance?
It's close. It is an act of remembrance, but Yar is year, and Zeit, time. The time. It's that time of year. So Yahrzeits literally means a time of year. It's not just a time where the person passes away, where we remember them. We mark the Yahrzeits on the day of their Hebrew death. So not on the Gregorian calendar, but on the Jewish date. And interestingly, if they had passed away at night, the Jewish calendar starts at night. Like the Sabbath or Yom Kippur starts the night before, right? So if they pass away at night, we don't go from 12 to 12. We go from sunset to sunset. So we mark the Yahrzeits, which anyone wants. There's plenty of calendars to figure this out. You just pump it in the English date. We do it that time of year to remember them. But it's not just that we remember on the day of their death, but Kabbalistically, actually is a big idea in Kabbalah, the day a person passes away is the day every year that they're judged. Why would they be judged? So we're all children in this room, right? So we're products of our parents. Every year when they're passed away, they're judged on how they did with us. Why? Because what we're doing is their fruit of their tree, right? So they're judged on us. We're judged on their grandchildren, on their great-grandchildren. There's a connection on the day of death to do it. So we try on that day to do things in their memory, to do things as a merit, and to remember our ancestors, our loved ones, our relatives, even a good friend, a teacher, somebody who impacted us positively. What if you're not sure of the day of death? Unfortunately, many of us, particularly with the Holocaust, you don't necessarily know when they passed away. So what many people do for the Holocaust is they will, if they know the day that their relative was taken to a concentration camp or a death camp, if they would mark that day, or the last time they would have seen the person, and you would pick a day. You could actually even pick a day under that circumstance. If you're not certain, by the way, and you have two dates and one's earlier, the general custom is to pick the earlier date. Okay. Also on a Yahrzeits, the day of that day where a parent, a sibling, grandparents, some people do, a child, God forbid. The custom is again to light candles, and as mentioned, it's the same idea as the verse in Proverbs, and to say Kaddish. Kaddish, right? What does Kaddish means to sanctify? Kaddish means that if we do things in this world, we sanctify our lives, we give merit to the deceased. So people and mourners in general say Kaddish. On the day of the Yahrzeits, we would say Kaddish for our loved ones, to give charity. There is an old custom that some people, it's not as popular today, but the old custom on Yahrzeits was actually to fast in memory of a loved one. If you look at the classical works, 300, 400 years in Lithuania and in Poland and in Germany, it would actually bring down the idea of fasting for the loved one. What is common today is that people give something called tikkun. They will come to synagogue and they bring a l'chaim, some scotch, some kichel, or they upgrade, they go to Pars, they get some rugelach. If you have to pick rugelach or kichel, it's a generational thing. I go for the rugelach personally. Can skip the herring, we get whitefish, lox. It's like, different. Actually, I have like herring, but it's not so popular, these days. So, but to bring something to people can bless, they can enjoy in memory of the loved one. If you're lucky enough to have a loved one buried next to you, this is a general thing. The custom is to go to the cemetery on the day of the Yahrzeits. It's actually Kabbalistically the soul is connected to that point, to there at that time of the day of death. Another idea how we can prevent people from having a second death, to memorialize for ourselves and to give a spiritual benefit, is to give the name to a child, to the baby. In my family, all of my siblings have two names. I'm named after my two great-grandfathers, who were both murdered in the Holocaust. Menachem was one great-grandfather, and Chaim was another great-grandfather. And all my siblings have, actually my sister has three names, Gittel Tova Bela. simply because we had so many relatives to name after. We had so many people who died in the Holocaust, and my parents, I'm one of 5 children. My parents never knew how many kids they're going to have. They're trying to literally, and they've, to give as many names as possible. There is a remarkable, this is both in the Talmud and in the works of Kabbalah, that the name that we're given impacts us. That our Hebrew name, our Jewish name, actually impacts who we are. And Ashkenazic Jews in particular have a custom for thousands, literally, many hundreds of years, to honor the deceased by naming after them, by giving the Jewish name, the Hebrew name that after, not to name after the living. Sephardic Jews, actually, in certain circles, could give a name after a living person. Ashkenazi Jews, absolute no-no. But it is a strong idea to give a name of a person. One of the ideas, of course, is, and this is an amazing thing, is that when you give the name, this is an amazing thing, you give somebody the name, there is a spiritual bond between the person you're named after and you. There is a spiritual connection to it. So actually, people who don't have anyone to name after, in certain circles called the great sages or great people, but there's actual a connection. The Noam Elimelech, who was one of the leading Hasidic individuals, the leading in his time, in the early 18th century in Poland, writes about this in particular, based on Kabbalistic sources, how you are bonded to your name. But even if on a rational level, I walk around named after my 2 great-grandparents. First of all, my grandmother, who passed away at 102, who was a remarkable lady and a survivor. I spoke about her a few times ago. She would always tell me, "You're named after my father." So she reminded me who I was named after as a little kid. She was fond of telling me who I was named after. But you think about who you're named after. It impacts you. When you have a name of somebody, you're not only spiritually connected to that person, but it impacts you, and it keeps the name alive. My son, Shlomo Eliezer, is named after my father-in-law. Passed away, unfortunately, too young of an age, but he's after my father. My father, that name Shlomo Eliezer, has been in the family for hundreds of years, and I'm pretty sure, I'm almost positive. My wife, I have in my genealogy, is a direct descendant of Rashi. Shlomo was Rashi's name. I'm pretty sure he's actually named from Rashi, going back 1,000 years. So the name itself impacts you, right? It impacts who you are. So if you're thinking of how to prevent a second death, how to keep loved ones alive, is to name people after them, to give the name. My daughter Shifra, who was born on Rosh Hashanah, so she's, it's a remarkable, she was born in 2012. My great-grandmother, who was born in 1880, and was murdered in the Holocaust in 1942. So when she was born, Shifra, I named her also for shofar, or Rosh Hashanah, or sheep, or meisim, to have good deeds. But Shifra, and there's no other Shifras in my family. Shifra's name was my great-great-grandmother, who passed away 70 years earlier. And when she was named on right after Rosh Hashanah in 2012, that name Shifra, which had been lost to my family, came alive again. Right? This Shifra Noodle, who was from Southeast, last name is Noodle. My cousin says that's where like noodles in his family. In Poland, you got the name last name Noodle. I don't know in America, but on my mother's side it was Noodle. So that name Shifra, though, my daughter has and she always says, "I'm named after Shifra Noodle." It impacts her. And one day I'll tell her stories about her great-great-great-grandmother. But it also kept the name alive. And there is an interesting question. It's brought out hundreds of years ago. There was a custom, this is a particular, it's about the Holocaust, that naming people who died young because they were murdered. People who had a bad reality. So there's actually a Polish sage, the Yamshel Shlomo, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, 16th century, writes down it's a custom not to give names of people who were murdered young. people who died tragically. So what about now? What about the Holocaust? So two things of that. If a person dies naturally when they're young, so Ray Feinstein brings, or Moshe Feinstein, who is one of the great sages the past 100 years, so he brings two proofs that it's okay, because King Shlomo died in his 50s, and and the prophet Samuel. Anyone? Any Samuels? Any Sams in the room? Any Solomons in the room? No one. Any relatives, Solomon or Samuel? I have a Shlomo, right? So the custom was to give those names, even though they died before 60, which is considered young. But that's if they have a natural death. Rabbi Kamenetsky says it's the age of 60. But what my parents do, and many other people do, if you want to follow this custom, is you gave two names, or you switch it. He actually says the name Yeshayahu became Yeshaya for that reason. That's the Moshe Feinstein brings down. So it's to have a little bit of a switch. But there is a little bit of a question about names when they're murdered. If they're older, it's not such a serious thing. The last thing I want to just touch and talk about, and then maybe I'll answer any questions, is genealogy and DNA. I'm a history person, and I'll tell you the truth. Several years ago, I was learning Parshas Bamidbar, the first book of the Book of Numbers, right in the beginning of the Book of Numbers, and right over there it talks, when you counted the Jewish people, it says, they were all counted according to their families. When they were counted in the desert, the 40-year sojourn in the desert, they were counted according to that. And I said to myself, some of my grandparents, they never talked about it. I mentioned one grandmother, she told me every story. I was having nightmares at 6 years old and 7 years old. Like, somehow my dreams I was in Treblinka. But her husband, my grandfather, he never, ever talked about the Holocaust. He never, ever talked about his past. Because again, he had seen his wife and 2 kids shot. Never, I knew nothing about his family. My mother knew nothing. He never talked about, all she knew was a couple of names. So I said, I would like to figure out where he's from, what the story is. My grandmothers talked, and my grandfather didn't say a word. My other grandfather also never spoke about his past. So I decided to research this idea, because Zachar is also Zachor, the lineage, know where you come from, right? Judaism, maternal Jew with father and mother, but the idea of tribes is to have a knowledge of where you come from. It's actually, when I started to do genealogy, you just see the impact, because if you look at my family tree, it goes like this, and then all of a sudden you see Majdanek, Treblinka, a lot of Belzik, or just the Holocaust, and it ends, and then you see going down. It's like it's when you look at a tree that way, it's like it really, you see the individual. But first of all, I want everyone who was killed to be remembered. I want that once you put it today, genealogy today, it's all on the cloud, it's online, right? You have it for posterity. So those names that of my relatives, of my great uncles and great aunts and aunt and uncle, because my grandfather was married before the war, who were murdered, who no one could remember, those names are there. There's no second death, right? My family will know that these were their relatives. But it also allowed me to find out remarkable things. So that grandfather, who I knew nothing about, I now can go back in his situation a couple hundred years. I know where he lived, I know about him, things I never knew about before. I can actually see the names earlier. I had no idea what was named for these people, coming out earlier in the family tree. And knowing that really impacts me. My wife, by the way, who has an amazing lineage. She's a descendant of Rashi, Tosfos, some of the German, French sages, the Cloynimus family, who Charlemagne brought from Italy and started Ashkenazic Jewry. She's a direct descendant of the Cloynimus family. The Maharalmi Prague, the Ramah from Krakow, the Marsha, for those who follow Chabad, she's a direct descendant of Tanya. But the remarkable thing, her last name is Zakheim, her maiden name. And Zakheim stands for Zera Kodesh Haim, that from holy seed. Her ancestor, her father's father, in the mid-17th century, actually died on a blood libel on Rosh Hashanah. And she walked around with her name Zakheim as a kid. And she said, more the people the relatives she didn't have their name, she thought about less, even though they're more prestigious. But this Zakheim, it impacted her to know where she came from. Like, remember I said in the beginning, if you wake up tomorrow, you don't know who you are. You don't know who your parents were. You don't know who your grandparents are. You don't understand who you are. When you have genealogy, you can see your family. It bothers me when someone says to me, where are you from? From Russia. Okay, Russia's a big country. Where? Poland. Right? You connect to who you are when you have genealogy. So I was able to find my other grandfather. This is a remarkable thing. All I knew about my other grandfather, my name in Europe was Luik. It wasn't Levine. Levine was, when they came to America, Luik means in Polish, Levite. So my other grandfather, all I knew was from Brok, which was a few kilometers from Treblinka. And he never spoke of anything. And when I started looking into genealogy, I came across actually one of the foremost Jewish genealogists in the world. It's a guy named Stanley Diamond. He's one of the people, Jewish Gen. Everyone heard Jewish Gen? Mm-hmm. So he was one of the people who did that. He came from a little town next to Brok, and he sent me an article that the first town that was reported in the Western press about Nazi atrocities was the shtetl of my grandfather Brok. And it describes this article in early 1939 in the war, how Brok, when the Nazis, 1,000 people, they took people to the synagogue, they burnt them alive. This is before the final solution. Burnt them alive. How they rounded up people. And you know what? And I never knew that about my grandfather. He never said that. I could never understand why my grandfather never talked. And then when I read about what happened in Brok, that he experienced, that was the first day of the Nazis. I couldn't even imagine that. Like when I look back now, I understand my grandfather better. And it really impacted me, even like the Levites. I took a DNA test, because if you're going to do genealogy, the way actually I cracked one of my grandfather's ancestry was I took a DNA test, and I got my parents to take the DNA test, because I could out mother's side and father's side. And because of that, my mother had a relatively close match. She had a second cousin match who had a family tree. And I was able to, through the DNA, get to my mother's father's, this grandfather. So I can now go, he's a Rosenbach and a Katzbach. I go way back with that. But the other thing is DNA, I took a Levite test, which is the Y chromosome. So the Y chromosome, you can actually, only get that from his father's 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 father. And there's something called a Cohen gene and a Levite gene. It's a remarkable thing. If Kohanim, and if the priestly class and the Levites are related, they should share this Y chromosome. And so they took lots of Levites and Kohanim. They said, could they find a common gene? Right? You can't prove that you're a Kohen or Levite, but it could show if you're related to other people claiming to be a Kohen or Levite. You got how that would work? Yeah. And you only get it from father's father. So I took this Levite test. I grew up being a Levite. Within an hour, I got an email from Israel by the king of the Levite gene, this guy Meir Gover. You have the Levite gene. Like within an hour of the test being published. Which is, when you think about that, like my family tradition, by the way, it's so statistically off whack that basically anyone over 50% of people claiming to be a Levite have this same gene on the Y chromosome, and it's a very small percent of otherwise Ashkenazic Jewry. So what's clear is that I'm related to all these other Levites. We all go back to a common ancestor in the 3rd century of the Common Era. That's how far they can track it. So that's, when you see that, when you know that, and it impacts you of where you come from, and your children or grandchildren, to impact them. I will tell you also that having been involved in genealogy, you're able to help lots of people. Once my tree got a little bit big, I have literally, I'm on, now I don't spend that much time on this, but I happen to be on Ancestry, Family Tree DNA, My Heritage, you really want to do it, you want to get 23andMe, I'm like, GenMatch, I'm on all of them. So I get emails, my grandparents died in the Holocaust, my parents, I know nothing about my past, I see you have a big tree, you're able to actually help people connect to who they are, to know who they are. It's a chesed, and people have helped me along the way plenty as well. You really are able to help people to connect in a very profound way. But I will tell you, most importantly, you help your own family children, grandchildren, relatives, to know where you come from, where they are. So if you're going to do DNA and genealogy, I would say for the Jews, because if you go to Ancestry, it's a great thing, but it doesn't have such a great Jewish database. You know, if you want to do Jewish database, I would recommend MyHeritage, which comes from Israel. It's one of the biggest genealogy and DNA, MyHeritage, or Family Tree DNA. Those are the two best. If you do one of those, you can then put it for free onto GenMatch, and GenMatch takes 23andMe, Ancestry, and anyone can put it onto GenMatch. So for genealogy, also something called Geni, Geni. You can do that at least for free. There's lots of people. By the way, in Geni, there's groups of like, I'm not gonna try to say this, Shezbarazin, like that's my grandfather is from there, or Jara, or Tomasz Lubelski. There are groups of genealogy groups and DNA groups that are there. If you're researching Poland or Lithuania, the Jewish Gen has the Polish records going back till 1650 in certain circumstances. So if you have last names, you have the talent, you can go really far back. You can't imagine how far back you can. If you have a little bit of information, you can uncover lots of things. And they actually have marriage records on their Jewish Gen. It's a remarkable thing called Jewish Gen, and also the Jewish Research Institute. They're both online services. You can really get far back. And again, it's a gift to your children, to your relatives, to bring these people's name and to keep it alive. Just to finish about memorializing, those are loved ones, our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, relatives who perished, who were murdered in the Holocaust. You know, I would say the last thing is the stories that we tell in our own homes. That, you know, the choices of things that we talk about. You know, it's in real life today in the social media age. When you think about a vacation, what matters at the vacation? At the end of the day, as far as everyone else but yourself, it's the pictures you take, what you post. Right? That's all people see. It's what you post today. It's what's there. The stories that we tell about our loved ones is what we post. We know what but what we give over to our children and grandchildren, or cousins, or relatives, or nieces, or nephews, or even the strangers. There was a person in my synagogue, for those few people that were here, and it was Avram Keisler. Remember Mr. Keisler? He was a Holocaust survivor, Ungarish Yid, a Hungarian Jew, and to this day, he's passed away over 7 years ago. He impacted people, right? He impacted people from his life and the stories that he told and the life that he lived. There's another person I never met before my time named Zelig Bern,
yes,
right? Whose Sefer Torah we use in our synagogue. This Zelig Bern, you know, didn't have children or grandchildren. He has relatives that go to
his nephew.
Beth David. What's the name of that? This is a niece also.
Peter.
And we also has, what's her name? There's another one from Beth David. There's also a cousin. But you know, she told me she was related. I'll hit me afterwards. But he didn't have any children. But that Sefer Torah, his name, the memories that people have, the way they talk about him, that's the legacy of Zelig Bern. That's the legacy of Avram Keisler. You know, Devorah Lipstadt, who many people heard from Emory University,
Sure.
who fought against Holocaust denial. She has
It still is.
It still is. Has a famous piece on Yizkor. And in that piece, she writes the following thing. When we remember, irrespective of whom we're remembering, a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, an aunt, or an uncle, teacher or mentor, these memories become part of us. As we internalize these memories, they change us and we evolve, we grow. So too, those who follow us and remember us may be changed by their memories of us. So in conclusion, I would say if we take some of these ideas of Yizkor, Yahrzeits, baby naming, genealogy or DNA to further our trees, and to write it down and to speak about those of our loved ones who, if they pass away today, or those who were murdered in the Holocaust, we not only impact ourselves, we impact those around us. That not only prevents a second death, but it's the greatest way, you know, Yehuda mentioned about having children, but the greatest way to keep our past alive is to bring it to the present and the future. So I hope some of these ideas I spoke about today are meaningful. I know for myself, to be honest, in preparing for this lecture, I thought about my relatives. I thought about my own loved ones, and we should all bring nachas. We should bring only good things to those who came before us, only those good things to those who brought us to this world, and we should keep the memories of those, especially those people whose lives were stamped out at young ages, only too early, by Hitler Yamach Shemo, that we should bring those names and those memories to the days of Messiah, to the days of Mashiach. Okay, thank you very much. You don't have to ask any questions, but if there's any questions that people have.